Good. I can do it from there. Yes. Okay. Cool.
Hello, everyone. Hey. So there's quite a lot of people here. I don't know if people have mistaken this for like a speed dating singles mixer event, but it's actually a panel. So if you need to leave, just go now. But this is Love on the Popular Front. We are the Popular Front. And yeah, we're going to have a good panel. Thank you for coming here rather than to something about Trotskyism or etc. We're going to start. We've got Danny Hayward, whose propositions on Unfulfillment is going to come first. Then we've got Rosie Stockton. I actually don't have the names to hand of any of your papers, but they'll introduce them all individually. Had one job. Then Kerstin Stakemeier, and then finally Maxi Wallenhorst, who you may have seen these two at a poetry reading last night. They are multi-talented. But yeah, I suppose we can just kick off with that. Welcome, everyone.
Does this work? Yeah, it works. Okay, I need to scream. Yeah, the title of this is Propositions on Unfulfillment, but the secret title is Unfulfilling Propositions. It's like not really done, but maybe it'll be a sort of unfulfilling reflecting surface for what everyone else has to say. And I'll just read it. The history of the category of love in the history of the category of Marxism is a history of the category of names. The history of the category of names is a history of the category of value. The history of the category of value is a history of the category of love. The history of the category of love is the history of Marxism, since Marxism is the history of the category of names for love, which is to say of the struggle over naming. They say it is love, we say it is unwaged work. Goes the first line of the 1974 text, Wages Against Housework, introducing the argument that the history of the category of names is the history of the category of work. Our domestic life and the law of our homes do not resemble your homes, wrote Jean Genet in his first novel, Our Lady of the Flowers. We love each other without love. Our homes do not have the sacramental character. The history of the category of our love without love is the history of resistance to categories, which is to say of the struggle against naming. They say it is this, and we say it is that. Names stick. The argument about this and that is the basic terrain of social struggle carried out at the level of names for things, as a struggle over value, to which names have a basic and inescapable connection. Most of us know that in modern English, the pronoun it is a mute grammatical marker, the singular, neuter, third-person pronoun, that it is this, enough maybe to sustain your attention for the next 17 minutes, because I'm dangling the possibility that I might eventually say something about what love is, instead of what is, instead of making jokes about grammar. But love is what it is. And the point of all of these feints and puns is to try to connect some thoughts about negative relationships to the name of love, to the history of fascism, which is the history of the category of gender, of pronouns. Quote, after the fall, however, when God's word curses the ground, the appearance of nature is deeply changed, writes Walter Benjamin in his well-known early essay on language as such and on the language of man. This text about naming seems to have very little to say about reproductive struggles, but it does have some useful things to say about the neuter third-person pronoun it. Quote, now begins its other muteness, which is what we mean by the deep sadness of nature. It is a metaphysical truth that all nature would begin to lament if it were endowed with language, though to endow with language is more than to make able to speak. Speechlessness, that is the great sorrow of nature. Benjamin's essay against the bourgeois conception of language is about naming as the central redemptive element of language. I don't have much to say about it except that this is itself a bourgeois essay, reliant on a bourgeois repertoire of citations and literary authorities. Its assertion that the names for things, given by God to Adam and by Adam to the animals of the Garden of Eden, communicates language as such, is popular in something called literary studies, because it permits scholars to talk about auratic or magical properties of language. It is also a sentimental romantic melodrama of restored wholeness that remains heavily reliant on bad pages of poetry by poets whose implicit ideas about hierarchy and value are both odious and trivial. Represent it in a different way, though, and it becomes a kind of allegory for the situation of the singular neuter third-person pronoun, what the Wages Against Housework text calls it. A cursed ground of social conflict occupied by mute animals, whether human or non-human can be left aside here, bearers of names that have been assigned to them by a higher authority, because nature is always, more or less by definition, what can't speak for itself. The singular, neuter, third-person pronoun exists in relation to its name, as in the same relation to its name as livestock does to the plastic tag stapled into its ear. This is maybe the one point on which Walter Benjamin and Silvia Federici agree. Our domestic life and the law of our homes do not resemble your homes. We love each other without love, which is to say, we love each other namelessly, in conscious recognition that we make use of a word that the dominant society controls and has denied to us. To make Genet's statement the same as Wages Against Housework's statement, we would have to rewrite it as an act of renomination. Your homes are not homes, your homes are not homes, but are in fact X, Y, or Z. But this is not what Genet does, and he doesn't seem interested in proposing a new name, only a new contradiction. This establishes a different possibility of contestation. We still love each other, but without love. It's a different kind of challenge. We use the same names to describe it, but unpredictably, inconsistently, and we do this even if we recognize that our own practices of description or naming are rendered illegible and inaudible by the cacophony of language as such, which is to say the language of God, which is to say the language of the state, which is to say that the language most of us speak most of the time, even now and even here. They say it's love. We say it's love too, but only right now. In the next sentence, we'll say something different. Here's the next sentence. So the poem, my eroticism is stirred by paint. I am not good with words. Words of love come with difficulty in this language. Having had no chance to explore the language intimately, nor to feel at all secure, nor to trust that love was reciprocal, and the images of sex would not simply reduce me to an animal to be filed in a bestiary, but paint. Show me a wall of paintings, a whitish wash of paint over black, a painting by any of the constructivists. Show me a million paintings and I would truly love. On a website run by the UK charity Solace Women's Aid, you can read a definition of a category of intimate partner abuse that the SWA refer to as love bombing. The definition goes, physical violence is only one side of domestic abuse. Domestic abuse can involve a wide range of abusive controlling behavior, including threats, harassment, financial control, and emotional abuse. Love bombing is where an abusive partner is bombarding love, in scare quotes, onto their victim and is part of emotional abuse and coercive control. Love bombing can be part of early signs of abuse in a relationship. They say it's love, but we say it is love bombing. So we put love in scare quotes in order to establish the distinction. At first glance, Anna Mendelssohn's poem here also seems to be a rejection of love language in favor of another expressive medium. But what is disavowed at the level of categories resurfaces at the level of phonemes. We love each other without love. The first line is a set of sonic program notes, anticipating the movement of the R sound of eroticism, filled out by a long vowel through words, explore, secure, trust, reciprocal. This musical thread disintegrates at verse 7 at the edge of an octet and is replaced with the uglier assonance of E, simply me, be, bestiary, before we get back to paint again. But who cares about vowels? In 1947, Jean Genet published his penultimate novel, Funeral Rites, a strange prose narrative come lyrical elegy for his lover Jean d'Econin, killed fighting in the French resistance in the last months of the war. It is a novel about the attenuation of love in the face of the physical absence of the dead lover, an attenuation that spreads in the form of a murderous wish across the surface of everything that remains still present. The sky opened its gates, writes Genet. Thin out my sleep on the brow of stillborn children. Thin out our love over the world. Thin out the world on our beds. Leave in your veiled wagons. I sleep beneath your door. The wind sleeps standing up. All these are themes which my voice could go in quest of you, Jean. I'm abandoning you. The furs are moving by themselves. You live elsewhere, stronger than I am, here among the dead, still unborn. The novel takes the form of a kind of mirror narrative. Jean Genet's relationship to Jean d'Econin is threaded in filaments and fragments and bits of straw and wilted flowers. Quote, black and green flies would alight on them and he would shoo them off with his flabby white hand, end quote. Through another invented narrative of the relationship between Jean's killer, a young French member of the collaborationist French militia of roughly the same age, and a member of the German Wehrmacht, who was the older of the two lovers, serves as the mirror for Genet himself. This already homophonous love between Jean and Jean can only be allowed by being converted and so degraded into the love between the anti-fascist Jean's killer and a Nazi. Anti-fascist love can be articulated or allowed only by being converted or degraded into sexual love between fascists. The memory of the consummation of Jean and Jean's relationship a month before Jean d'Econin's murder is an explicit plot point. Genet begins his novel by describing the bronze eye, which he, Jean, did not grant me until very late, about a month before his death. It gets played out in the novel's final scenes in the form of an exchange between Jean's killer and the Nazi countertype of Genet. Quote, I now have the impression I love you more than before. This phrase was offered to me 3 months ago by Jean, and I put it in the mouth of a militiaman whom a German soldier has just buggered. Riton murmured, I now have the impression I love you more than before. Eric did not understand. No tenderness could have been expressed, for as their love was not recognized by the world, they could not feel its natural effects. Only language could have informed them that they actually loved one another. We know how they spoke to each other at the beginning. Seeing that neither understood the other and that all phrases were useless, they finally contented themselves with grunts. The connection in Mendelssohn's poem, Genet's novel, and Benjamin's essay, oh my God. This is what happens when you try and go slowly. With animality as a dimension of naming is not incidental. Benjamin, the life of man in the pure spirit of language was blissful. Nature, however, is mute. True, it can be clearly felt how this muteness, named by man, itself becomes bliss only of a lower degree. Friedrich Müller has Adam say of the animals that they leave him after he has named them, and say by the nobility with which they leaped away from me that man had given them a name. Draw a line between this almost touchingly kitsch exercise in theologico-linguistic melancholic yearning for restored wholeness and Mendelssohn's nor to trust that love was reciprocal and that images of sex would not simply reduce me to an animal, or Genet's, they finally contented themselves with grunts. They say it is this, and we say we don't care what they say it is. We don't care about that. We don't care about this or that or it at all. And that the refusal to even bother to rename this thing, to say anything about it whatsoever, represents another harder to grasp form of contestation, 1 degree away from no contestation at all, from no contest, from contestation at its mute, sullen, uncommunicative degree 0, its limit, itself nameless, and thus a form of contestation of a lower degree in the hierarchy of contestation's forms. They say it's love, but I am not good with words. Words of love come with difficulty in this language. They say it's love, and we say it's love too. But now the it has changed in ways that we decline to spell out. If you know, you know. And now it has changed in ways we choose not to define. We can note in passing that it also no longer leaps away with nobility from man, like some nameless and yet also somehow pedigree dog, chasing its tennis ball of a lower degree of bliss over the recreation ground of ideology and bearing its name on its collar, its speechless tongue hanging out. They call it ideology. We call it the Garden of Eden. The main difference between Genet and Mendelssohn is the probably obvious one that for Genet, the name of love was something from which he was banned. Their love was not recognized by the world. Whereas for Mendelssohn, it was what Solace Women's Aid write on their website that it was, part of emotional abuse and coercive control, a 0 degree of intimacy that in theory resembles the argument of wages against housework, which in Mendelssohn's poem leads to the abandonment of words of love altogether in favour of paint, a term that has surely only an accidental phonetic resemblance to grunt. You could say there's a kind of disguised political realism here in the recognition that there really is, as I've been stressing all the way through this, no contest, a disguised realism in the form of a refusal to even enter the contest over names, in the recognition that it doesn't matter what we say or what we call it, because the power to assign or name names is itself integrated with much larger structures of economic and social control, and it is a fundamental aspect of the class politics, broad sense, of naming, that there are those who name and those who are assigned names, and that the whole relationship to the social practice of naming is defined not on the basis of consciousness, but on the basis of one's position within the social hierarchy. In other words, that some of us will always be the animals who a name, no matter what we do, no matter how often we say with wages against housework what it is in our opinion, and that we are not good with words because words are social power structures that are not good with us, that words are not good for us, and that there are times that we will communicate in grunts or mute colours using the names we've been assigned or not at all. Last paragraph. I first came to Mendelssohn's poem earlier this year, not while thinking about love, but about despair. Its power for me belonged to the fact that it seemed to be about giving up. It's at the point of giving up on love, insofar as they call it love, and that this world is their world and not ours, and life is short, that something else becomes possible, the paints or grunts of speech conducted in a wholly different medium. There could be no discovery of this other form of expression without the prior recognition that the terrain of struggle of love, language, had to be abandoned, and that the terrain of struggle of the language of terrain of struggle had to be abandoned too. And it was in this movement of abandonment that something precarious, call it the possibility of happiness or fulfillment, crawls back into the space of the poem in the form of a realization. They call it love, we call it nothing at all. We no longer call it anything. We no longer even call out. We no longer recognize that there is an it that we share in common with them, even if it turns out to be nothing except the work relation of unwaged reproductive labor, the cursed ground of a social system in which what they call this and we call that turns out to be no difference at all, because what we have recognized is the whole system of names turns us into animals and not a specific act of nomination. The more I read Mendelssohn's poem with its frustrating and maybe just bad closing ambivalence between sentimental desire and aching cynicism, the less sure I am of what it does. So, the end, to be filed in a bestiary, but paint, show me a wall of paintings, a whitish wash of paint over black, a painting by any of the constructivists, show me a million paintings and I would truly love. The penultimate line here is a kind of switch, depending on whether you read it as a rush of desire, show me all the paintings ever, or an unmeetable condition, you have to show me more paintings than I could ever actually see. The final line, then I would truly love, with its Siamese twins of gold standard Platonic names, love, truth, reads as either climax or letdown. If you rewrite Benjamin's essay on names from the perspective of the animals, I'm suggesting, which is to say from the perspective of the singular, neuter, third-person pronoun it, then it should be obvious why political practice in relation to language includes the hatred of names as such, as well as the tactical, strategic, or polemical practice of renaming, a practice which accounts for much of the modern history of Marxism as an unfolding theoretical tendency. I first came to Mendelssohn's poem because I wanted to write an essay about the political uses of despair, but then I got distracted by the history of this practice, which is the political history, broken across lines of gender and sexual object choice, of love as a practice of naming, of the refusal of names. As I was beginning it, a friend, I don't know if, Ollie, are you here? Yeah. As I was beginning this, a friend sent me a video of the funeral of the Ukrainian anarchist David Shikan, along with an AI-translated transcript of a podcast interview given by his partner in October, a few months after his death on the front lines of the Ukrainian War of Defense on 9th of August 2025. It's a really short video, so I'll just show it. The video begins with the hissing sounds of a flare. The flare appears held in the left hand of the camera person. I'm done, basically. The camera in their right, first-person shooter perspective, smoke and pale red light in daylight, then a pan across a group of people dressed in black, red and black flags, rainbow flag, flag of Ukraine, a St. Pauli hoodie worn by a man in the front row, a confusion of political symbols. They say it's nationalism, we say it's love. The practice of naming in conditions that are not of our choosing as an act of love that makes us, as Jean Genet insisted love must be, if it was to be real, categorically indistinguishable from the love of our worst enemies, the love of the murderers of those whom we love, from the love of the nationalists who can only be defeated if their love can become our love, a reality in which there is no love of a lower degree. The camera finally moves down to show the grave, people shoveling in loose grey dirt with their hands, more smoke and more flames, thinning out over the world, thinning out on our beds, the podcast transcript with the surviving lover talking about the singular one who is lost and cannot be replicated or brought back, because even those who love them cannot be them. The dead are not safe. There are no names for this. They can call it what they want, though at one level it is clearly reproductive work, the work of reproducing the image and example of those who we love imperfectly, because we are not good with words of love, because they are not good with us, neither in Benjamin's Garden of Eden, in which we take the perspective of the named, not of the namers, nor in Kiev's Independence Square, which is no Eden, but which by an act of love can still come to mean more than they think. Thanks.
Then we've got Rosie Stockton and a brief sort of technical interlude.
Drag the thing over to that side.
Okay, can you hear me? Danny, that was thrilling. Thank you. And thank you all for being here. My paper is called Aiding and Abetting Totality, Surplus Love, Surplus Poems. In Unconfined, organized here. In Unconfined, Jessica Cohen, a poet serving a life sentence in the California Institution for Women's Rights. The thought that love would set me free only separated who I am within. Cohen wrote Unconfined in response to Assata Shakur's poem Love, which she wrote in exile in Cuba in 1987, a decade after escaping from the Clinton Correctional Facility for Women in New Jersey. In Love, Shakur famously makes a claim for love's emancipatory capacity. Love is contraband in hell, because love is an acid that eats away bars. She continues with a vow between you, me, and tomorrow, displacing the bourgeois couple that promises futurity to each other in favor of a revolutionary dyad colluding with futurity. Tercets unravel into a litany of declarative statements as the couple form is reflected in the double barrel of the shotgun and the two blades of the hacksaw in service of the reproduction of freedom. Echoing Fanon's vision of true love in black skin, white masks, attachment becomes conspiracy rather than that Aldurian belonging and all its unconscious perversities and racialized tactics colonized and colonial subjects employ to deal with our own lack. Love for Shakur is not privatized attachment, but political relation. It is contraband capable of destituting unfreedom and promising an alternate futurity. From Cohen's perspective, though, sentenced in the context of the post-1980s California carceral state and gutted welfare system, love is just as easily personally destructive, foreclosed, toxic, traumatizing, and even life-threatening. And fundamentally, love's promise of futurity is foreclosed. She writes, if love is an end, let me not start. Here, single lines float without the company of couplets nor tercets. The dispossessed, possessive individual imagines her unconfinement as a reclaiming of a sense of an autonomy from the, quote, perceptive fallacy of love's narrative arc. Like Shakur, she understands love in relation to struggle, yet where Shakur figures love as corrosive to captivity, Cohen equally sees love as the mechanism through which captivity is intensified. Rather than destitute the carceral forms, love has destituted her personhood, separating herself from who she is within. Contraband has become compromise. Compromise has become evidence. Evidence has become the end. This paper's inquiry lives between the lines of these poems, thinking through the registers of love's relationship to freedom, particularly in the face of the carceral state's management of the race and gender's remainders of surplus population. In this context, I ask how the carceral state manages love as it is mobilized and bound to the double characteristic of social reproduction. As Sylvia Federici puts it, to reproduce capital as labor power, and also to reproduce our lives in all of our capacity to revolt against being reduced to labor power. What follows then is a materialist inquiry into love itself as surplus, as affect, and as infrastructure. Cohen's poem, written from the standpoint of surplus in response to Assata Shakur's love, and also to a poem by Wanda Coleman called The Notes of a Cultural Terrorist, too, registers the painful contradictions of social reproduction, value, and criminalization in deindustrialized California and the realignment of social reproduction in the late 20th century Los Angeles, all writing under the castigated sign of love. I want to argue that by approaching the poems with a view to the negativity of social reproduction offers a means by which we can avoid political horizons that become reified into positions of either simple affirmations of love or abstract negations of love. Rather than idealizing love as emancipatory in romantic or liberal senses, Cohen negotiates the lived experience of love with nowhere to go. Unable to be efficiently absorbed into the nuclear family to reproduce labor power, yet persisting via a negativity constitutive of, yet outside values relation to the maintenance of capital. Love's relationship to freedom had been the topic of the workshop at CIW, the California Institution for Women, that Cohen is a participant in and that I am a facilitator of. The workshop emerged from organizing with women serving life sentences in the California Coalition for Women Prisoners, a group founded by incarcerated women in California in the 1990s. The workshop was at first figured as a site to meet and connect via the heartbreak of incarceration beyond the political demand to produce positive categories, names, conducive to emancipatory grammars. Instead, it was a space to let contradiction unfold. In the weekly sessions, I bring poems or they request them. We read, discuss, write, and respond to each other. The relationships in the workshop are layered, both pedagogical, political, and affective, and shaped by the structural asymmetry of unfreedom. In taking up Cohen's poem as an object of critique, I do not want to suggest the carceral relation can be transcended simply via recognition, but rather only inhabited by what Saidiya Hartman would call encumbered relationality. The encumbered reading I practice here exists alongside the encumbered conditions of their writing. For these poets, the scenes of their criminalization were inextricable from scenes of love and reproduction. And the poets in the workshop had come to agree that, like Audre Lorde says, poetry was not a luxury to express contradiction, but there was still a lot of skepticism about love. No doubt, throughout the history of poetry, love has been alternatively depicted in its capacity to free, redeem, disappoint, bind, hold captive. And so the workshop embarked on traversing the many articulations of love. We approached the tension between Michael Hart's figuration of bad love, figured as narcissism, and good love, figured as openness to transformation. We approached love as the individual affect via the sonnet. We considered the political love poems of June Jordan. We read Love Poem by Ahmed Al-Mallah, who links Adorno's famous condemnation of poetry after Auschwitz with his claim that love is excluded from fascism. Quote, I wanted to write a love poem, but instead I watched the news. There is talk of Syria falling. There is talk of Syria rising. In response to this poem, another poet in the class named Indigo wrote, I wanted to write a love poem, but I don't love you. This sentiment became a chorus. Political crisis wasn't in the way of the poem. Love itself was the crisis in the way of the poem. Love, as we know, has always been called on to aid and abet property relations and normative forms of social life under capital and its attendant carceral infrastructures. Affect is mobilized as alibi, love launders legal contradictions into sentiment, and stabilizes reproduction through emotional attachment. The lyric poem historically accompanies this affective regime, staging love across privatized terrains of feeling. Alongside troops of longing lovers and sonneteers, the possessive individual embodied by the lyric I has addressed their other half with narrative expectations of romance, till death do us part, in sickness or in health, for richer or for poorer. As we've seen for the poorer and for the dispossessed, though, poems come to document love's insurgency. In the workshop, we also read Wanda Coleman's poem, Notes of a Cultural Terrorist, too, which portrays the daily life of surviving the hyper-policed, gutted welfare state in the 1990s in Los Angeles, culminating in the Rodney King riots in LA in 1992. In the poem, Coleman recasts the task of reproducing life as domestic warfare. The war to feed the children, the war to clothe their backs, the war to meet the rent, the war to keep the gas tank full. Interweaving personal anecdotes of witnessing riots, experiencing neglect in a hospital, brokenheartedness in a bar, and being cuffed in the back of a cop car, Coleman ends each stanza with the repeated phrase, I am a soldier. Making dinner for your kids and lovers and friends is usually not considered an act of war, but in the context of the state abandonment, need and desire are collapsed under the blurry banner of love. Social reproduction and its practices we cannot help but associate with love, to quote Pat Benatar, is a battlefield. In Coleman's register, we might reformulate the Wages Against Housework manifesto. If they say it is love, we say it is unwaged work. If they say it is love, we say it is warfare. Ruth Wilson Gilmore's analysis of the California prison boom clarifies the political economic context of this scene, the one from which Cohen too writes. Post-industrial state restructuring in California produced surplus population and surplus land, which the carceral state managed through the expansion of policings and prisons in the 1980s until around 2010, where surplus populations that the economy cannot otherwise absorb during crises of overaccumulation became criminalized and warehoused. Without recourse to employment or welfare, Coleman writes, people are looting, taking things, all the excess denied them. Children carry racks of clothes, women push shopping carts brimming with food. In this figuration, the riot is a form of social reproduction, a form of surplus love. To quote Gilmore, it is an alternate form of social reproduction given their utter abandonment by capital. While the most notorious Reagan-era tough-on-crime laws like the mandatory minimum sentences and 3 strikes law targeted and underemployed Black men who were incarcerated at skyrocketing rates, at the same time, a particular set of tough-on-crime laws passed in the 1980s that disproportionately affected women, particularly women of color. These latter laws increased culpability for conspiracy, collusion, and aiding and abetting, which includes things like driving getaway cars, being present at the scene, quote, masterminding. Culpability expanded to account for social relations and reproductive attachments, which disproportionately ensnared women who maintained ties of care to criminalized men. For example, 90% of women who are serving life without parole in California are sentenced under the felony murder law alongside co-defendants who are named the main perpetrator, who they were overwhelmingly intimately entangled with. As tough-on-crime laws ideologically and materially turned the unemployed worker into the criminal, and the state managed the reproduction of criminality and criminalized forms of survival in the private sphere through broadened frameworks of culpability, they started to encompass racialized, feminized, and queer subjects. The argument is not to reproduce any evaluative claims for innocence or guilt, nor reify gender as a positive category, but rather to emphasize how love's tie to social reproduction of surplus population became an additional target for the carceral state. Social reproduction becomes criminal infrastructure, and love that is unable to be harnessed in the family form to produce value for capital must be, in Gilmore's terms, warehoused. We must read the last lines of Shakur's poem, Love. We are a conspiracy in the most literal legal sense. I now turn from surplus love's capacity to conspire and reproducing surplus population as a form of labor to its negative relation to value. Criticizing tendencies in social reproduction theory that ontologize labor and reify gender, Marina Vishmet and Zoe Sutherland have argued that labor frameworks alone fail as operative fantasy in an era of mass and underemployment and highly monetarized, often abandoned surplus populations. They argue we must examine how the lived reality of surplus through categories of race and gender pose an internal outside to the capitalist value relations, disrupting the affirmation of reproductive labor or moralizing care work, or asserting a trans-historical revolutionary love that could be somehow inherently redeemable. Negativity becomes key for anti-carceral Marxist feminisms. Reframing love as surplus via social reproduction's negativity is a means by which to approach the reification of gendered and race relationality refracted through the conditions of abandonment and carcerality. We might say Cohen's conditional stance toward love as it is lived through its race and gendered perspective aids and abets totality. The negativity of carceral social reproduction indexes both structural abandonment, enlistment by totality, and radical possibility that defies subsumption, the refusal to be wholly instrumentalized by capital, and the persistence of life where it should not exist. It is from this locus where social reproduction confronts its own negativity, and where love figures both captivity and contingency, that we can see surplus love, per Vishmet and Sutherland, quote, within capitalist relations, social relations as antagonistic and dominating form of social unity from the perspective of its overcoming, not its maintenance. My last paragraph. Cohen writes, if love is an end, let me not start. Speaking here in the conditional, her tone is neither sentimental nor cynical. It is weary and ironic, for of course, she has started and she will endlessly go on. Quote, my battle is mine and in every sense endless. Politicized affect theory might argue that the invitation to non-sovereignty, being separated from who we are within, is perhaps love's greatest achievement, per Berlant, to become revolutionized and open and yet more oneself. But of course, Cohen's reference to non-sovereignty is carcerally literalized. Quote, the walls of my prison get taller. In Cohen's unconfined love, she doesn't imagine that which splits her from within, nor which separates her from the other, has dissolved. Her vision of freedom is one that still holds the signifier of confinement, unconfined, freedom linked with its own negativity. Instead, she figures a way of, we might say, seizing the means of one's non-sovereignty from the affirmative grammars of both emancipatory love and romantic love. For Cohen's unconfined love is figuring how she might be undone on her own terms. Quote, leave me to draw my own invisible lines. She closes the poem not as a means to assert a self-possessed individual embarking on a, quote, healthier property love, nor a revolutionary free love. She asserts instead a mode of opacity via withholding this universalizing demand. If they say it is love, I say what it is mine to behold. Disrupting the temporal narrative arc of romance or reproduction, wages or survival, Cohen demands a radical contingency toward enacting a difference towards a non-reified social experience, and one that perhaps has political significance to open to determination in specifically situated emancipatory struggles. If, as Coleman insists, the war goes on, as Shakur asserts, love as a conspiracy, and Cohen's battle is endless, then love's negativity must not be overcome nor valorized, but embraced as the historicized terrain of struggle, a place to behold and be held. Thanks.
Thing about Marxists is when they say they got one paragraph left, that means like anything.
Yeah. Yeah, I can also do PDF. There's also a PDF version. Right. Can I?
I think you just press.
Where is it? Sorry. You don't have to press. Yeah, but it shouldn't move by itself. Will it?
Okay.
Can I just?
No.
Should I do PowerPoint? PDF?
Okay. Well, let's just try that. Maybe that'll be easier.
And I can just.
Yeah.
Okay. This work. Yeah.
Okay, now go.
Okay.
Stakemeier.
Yes. Let's see. This is so small. Hi. I'm going to speak about the Popular Front, or from the Popular Front, and I'm going to end with a bit of love. And I start from changing the title, obviously. It was called Rededicating the Popular Front. It kind of still is, but where I want to get to is the Popular Front of Senses. Whoops. Sorry, I just turned off accidentally my paper. Let's try again. Okay. Recently, in returning to the origins of the Popular Front against fascism in the mid-30s, I came across a lot of GDR art history. Because where Popular Front anthologies published on the fringes of capitalized academia almost invariably aim at a critical historical valuation of what's past, the GDR versions with almost the same consistency insist that the task of realism that shaped it is contagious for as long as is it not fulfilled. All pasts, all presents, all futures have to be codified in terms of their realism. Where in Western Marxism, criticality is what relates the political individual to its communion, its class, aesthetically equipping their systemic strive. In GDR art history, this cultural individuation is understood as a mere autofiction to which realism is introduced as the only real question in and of art. In a 1987 Dietz Verlag publication, co-authored by Erwin Pracht, Michael Franz, Wolfgang Heise, Karin Hirdiner, Reinhard May, Günther Meyer, and Ulrich Rösner, which I will come back to, author collectives. The lead argument of the realism chapter is that with the exposure of the avant-garde concept as politically dysfunctional, Western art after 1945 too has at last taken a realist turn. Jean Cocteau is quoted saying that true realism strips the things of their normalized relations and isolates their alien essence. An argument for the lived sensuality of realism here. And not much later, postmodern architecture is discussed as a rejection of technological optimism, a building from traditional forms that brings human touch and Volkstümlichkeit, the folkic, back into construction. It too is a realism, one yet unsure of itself, but still. I will say Volkstümlichkeit a lot, and I will use folkic because it's not folklore. Like folkic is a word which Fumio Kiji has used for exactly that, which has been termed folklore, but is a folkic structure within all forms of aesthetic production, which modernism has tried to appropriate within itself, but like fails in really grasping. And Volkstümlichkeit is a word that is everywhere in the realism debate, as we will see. The East Berlin dramaturg Heiner Müller had held out for Volkstümlichkeit in New York a good 10 years earlier when he gave a talk on postmodernism relating to its non-progressivism. And I quote, Müller, in the realm of necessity, realism and the folkic, das Volkstümliche, are two separate things, Müller said. And he goes on, the split goes through the author. And I say, this is where critique lives. Müller adds that realism and Volkstümlichkeit need to be congruent because any periodization is but colonial policy as long as history is not its universal history. Sure. Realism is the only tendency worth realizing, or I would say realism is the only fantasy grounding an emancipatory real. And the aforementioned author collective adds that what has been one of our gravest mistakes so far is that even in the East, realism, more often than not, was conceptually grounded in exactly those bourgeois genres and periodizations, like the bourgeois novel. Instead of prolonging colonial culture, realism needs to be understood rather from its foundation in what they call world art there. It's the 80s. So, in short, the Leninist understanding of Bildung, education, has to come undone and needs itself to be decolonized to understand realism. I'm a fan. I might actually become a GDR art historian. I mean, think of where realism and the folkic appear quite specifically ruptured right now, or try and think of where they're actually not ruptured right now. And about those ruptures. Sorry. Marina Wishmet called them gaps and writes, I would suggest that art's heavily caveated microhistory of form involves a miss or non-recognition of another means, a path of errancy when it comes to form and its wavering possibilities. This could be called the metamorphosis of gaps. Gaps rather than voids, for instance, because a void already hypostasizes its emptiness as completeness, whereas a gap subsists in relation. A void is thus always aspiring to the status of an object, where a gap is cut into time or language. We can think of the gaps as the errancy of a system, the negativity at the core of its positive appearance or structural integrity in the world. End quote. Here's the split Müller speaks of again. As in Müller himself, also for us, working from such splits, gaps, and ruptures may resort here and there to some clumsy romantic anti-capitalism, trying to conjure realism in Volkstümlichkeit and vice versa, but romantic anti-capitalism does transition into its more insurrectionist, more synthetic, more present tense other disalienation. If sadly not by necessity, then most definitely by organization. And it is in this sense, in understanding the Popular Front as understanding the Popular Front as an intentional transition from tropes of romantic anti-capitalism into practices of disalienation, that I cannot but agree with GDR art history that the peasant wars of the early 16th century appear to be a much more appealing place to historically root my provincialism than the sentimental education of the late 18th century, Romanticism. And of course, Sam Dolbear just did a really great panel on more of this. So again, realism versus criticism. Starting from the communal senses, the spontaneous forms of a mass rebellion of needs, rather than from the outstanding formulations of isolated sentiments of modern alienation. Or, more precisely, reading the latter through the former. Everything will be realism. GDR art history reads like an inverted history of modern life in which 7 people author collectives write 700-page volumes with extremely modest titles, like Ästhetik der Kunst. And this is the history of the, this is an illustrierte Geschichte. What is it, like
Illustrated history.
Image? Thank you, illustrated history. That wasn't so complicated. Of the peasant wars, and it is the best cover any book has ever had, I would say. Right, let's go on. That's the 700 pages written by 7 people. And this book, this is the table of contents. And they very casually start the book by stating for decades, the consensus was art is not autonomous, but heteronymous, of course. To then look at the genesis of art's autonomy as an exemplary narrative of the dematerialization of social freedom in modern times. Or take one of the many issues of the 100-part pamphlet series zur Kritik der bürgerlichen Ideologie, that does translate, dedicated to Theodor W. Adorno, in which Peter Reichel concludes that, and I quote, Adorno's main method for constituting the future is that of the mirror reflex, that's Adorno's word. The guarantor of the future appears to be the truth as concept and as property, wherein the truth is being manufactured by the negation of current reality, end quote. Again, I cannot but agree. Adorno figures a negation within properties, not of properties. Amazing ruptures, yes, but an insurmountable resistance against disowning sentimental Bildung. The general insistence on the material historicity of realism that runs through GDR art history, its emphasis on its inescapable falsification by ownership, it has a strong penchant for finitude, for negative historicity, and again, I find it extremely relatable today. Because where negativity enables itself to hibernate, it does become a Bildungsgut. Allegorically, ruinously, beautifully, yes, but dead, definitely. In narrating realism out of the peasant wars of the 16th century, or more trenchantly, in holding on to the inevitable communion of realism and Volkstümlichkeit, the Folkig, a popular front of rebellious decolonization engages art as an element of subsistence, an infrastructural need, the lives and death of which its art history narrates. In that sense, GDR art history sees autonomous art and modern history more generally as a form of harm, a perspective of unending terminal care. Taking art out of its living senses to turn it into a somewhat toxic token of colonial periodization, unrealized. Frederick Jameson appears to have had homological hopes for realism, positing that it must begin with the promise of immediacy, of a contact with a unique and contingent reality, a specific and unpredictable conjuncture, a subject's intense singularity, the unmistakable flavor of a region, an unexpected historical event. Yeah, he goes all out. Yes. But only 6 lines later, he concedes that realism is a mere postponement of reification, and until not so much further notice. Why so linear? And then he goes all Bildungsroman, and I'm out. Returning to GDR art history, which suddenly now appears distinctively less Leninist than him. Gudrun Klatsch, who worked both with and on Heiner Müller. Do I have it? Yeah. Offers a series of more qualified realist gaps in the works of Lifshitz, Lukács, Lunacharsky, Bloch, and Benjamin, like all stars. But she has no interest in qualifying any of them as realists. Instead, she qualifies an unaligned series of realisms within their work, which once again defies the autonomy, negativity, property complex in following lifelines like that of Bloch, who, at the onset of the Expressionism debate with Lukács in 1934, offered, and I quote Bloch, the non-simultaneity of many impulses, reactions, and reaction foundations as the weather vane within the coming popular front. I love the idea of a weather vane of non-simultaneities, qualified ruptures, once more. When Georg Lukács, Bloch's major opponent in the Expressionism debate, coined the term romantic anti-capitalism not much earlier in 1931, he did so not least to disown his own pre-Marxist writings before 1918. But even for him, the term never fully figured as a mere self-debasement, but also as a Bildungsgap, a possible figure of transition. Its most prominent custodian, Michael Löwy, famously identified romantic anti-capitalism's core in the nostalgia for a pre-capitalist society and cultural critique of capitalism, which doesn't sound too realist, but very folkic. And it seemingly poses it within an unbridgeable distance to disalienation's radically materialist commitment to understand the present lives of alienation itself as the only working materials of disalienation, as spelled out in Frantz Fanon's early political writing, but also in the psychiatric practices he imported it from, like his own and those of his colleagues, Francesc Toscayes or Lucien Bonafé. Both Lukács and Löwy register romantic anti-capitalism as a Weltanschauung pertinent to alienated life. And as such, it is effectively also the working material of disalienation, whose ultimate goal I would draw very near to Heiner Müller's wish to make realism and Volkstümlichkeit coextensive. and open up history towards its anti-colonial periodization, a living realism. And yesterday, Elena Vogtman gave a paper on disalienation here, and there's a really great text on it by her on Grey Room's website. So while romantic anti-capitalism projects a past becoming a future, disalienation's commitment to the very present, in which all times materially concatenate, includes this very past. So while romantic anti-capitalism's nostalgia gives way to an obvious incoherence, its more anarchic versions also offer, as Andrew Hemingway quotes Loewy, ambiguity, ideological hermaphroditism, and a surprising tendency to move from one extreme to the other, end quote. Ruptures. So all of this is more of a methodological sketch, obviously, about how to have fun with realism and Volkstümlichkeit. And I'm going to end on love, which means I'm going to end. As one such romantic anti-capitalism, a nostalgia awaiting its disalienation. It's one more paragraph and one more quote. In 1987, the sexologist Eberhard Schorsch wrote a short essay titled Components of a Theory of Love. And he's really interesting because he understood sexuality from forensics, from its criminalization, not from endocrinology, which is true for like a lot of that leftist debate in Germany. Anyway, in this text, he argues that the foundation of his science was the conceptualization of sexuality itself, which was an effect of late Romanticism's reactionary turn in the early 19th century. As usually, the word sexuality itself was taken out of biology, plant life. And its inception generated a rupture that distinguished sexuality as a faculty, a set of standards, a split from and of the senses, feelings, fantasies, and realities of the social praxis it was and is. So lust gained its own set of reified language, intended to isolate the accountable subject and its sex, rather than moving through the shared senses and sexes with what is lived in lust and passion. In Schorsch's words, we have sex, we have asex, or we have an orgasm. They are our properties. And the love within which lust and passion maneuvered without necessarily being presently owned, the love that had been in no need to fully articulate its sexuality, it was relegated to its romanticist irrealism, to use another one of Loewy's terms, a literary faculty on the one hand, and to its stately ownership, marriage, on the other. Sexology codified the periodization of love and sexuality as nodes of colonial policy. Schorsch draws out how romantic love as a bourgeois ideal only came into being with the making of sexuality as a pathological contention, and how the rupture that was introduced between them refigured not just their relation, but tied them to one another, creating the perpetual necessity to justify the appearance of one devoid of the other. Like no love without sex, no sex without love, like the marriage equation, or the unhappy marriage equation. In this sense, something like Samuel Delaney's attempt to find a language for sex would be totally within Müller's horizon of unifying realism and Volkstümlichkeit, a popular front of senses. So historically, in more than one sense, love does have a genuine rapport with poetry. It is where its secularized form went to die into marriage or irrealism. And this is something that more sex cannot fix. Talal Asad makes a remark about T.S. Eliot, of all people, that seems weirdly radiant in that respect. T.S. Eliot had claimed in 1921 that the separation of thought from feeling, for which he coined the term dissociation of sensibility, first emerged in England in the poetry of the later 17th century and thus facilitated the process of secularization. Typical of the best of those later called metaphysical poets, writes Eliot, was the direct sensuous apprehension of thought or a recreation of thought into feeling, end quote. Ha! Anyway, the gaps in our senses have come a long way of colonial periodization. I'm genuinely curious to understand more where realism and Volkstümlichkeit meet in love, and obviously take other papers here as exactly the answer to that. Let's see where the colonial consistencies of our love and sexes into the insufferable, stately, and pathological idea of one love and one sex per person end and have been ending. To end with the by now much too obvious James Baldwin quote, "Love has never been a popular movement, but it sure as hell needs to be." Thank you.
Kerstin's just leaving us with this. No. Okay.
I'm good. This. Yeah. Okay. Okay. We usually find love on the side of queer liberalism, of corporate pride floats, of the renunciations of heteropessimist therapy speak, or rebranded as care, vulnerability, etc. Where love is love, it's not for us. On our side, the side of a queer Marxist feminism that, for the purposes of this paper, I will call, annoyingly, transmaterialism, we tend to keep our distance to love. The Wages Against Housework Manifesto says it clearly. They say it is love. We say it is unwaged work. Or in a more queer, more recent register, we might say it is desire and its reification. It's the name of sexual hegemony. We might say it is simply fucking plus the family form. I wanted to put like very funny jokes here, but I didn't come up with good enough ones. So. With Jody Rosenberg and Kay Gabriel, we can understand the object of transmaterialism to be not simply trans people or transness, but the abstraction of sex from the standpoint of sex change. Transmaterialism is a materialism against cisness, to quote Emma Heaney, the racialized presumption of sex naturalness. What would it mean to turn to their word here, to let love return? This paper finds itself looking for love as a scene of this critique, exploring how perhaps precisely in its imprecision and ambivalence, love might name something in the scene of gender that is irreducible to currently more intuitive concepts like care or community recognition. If the materialism that proceeds through gender is a materialism of how we want it all, it is also a materialism of how we don't have it, or not in any recognizable form, of how we struggle to give it to each other. A materialism that doesn't stop at heartbreak. Dysphoria can feel like heartbreak, Andrea Longchu wrote in her game-changing essay on liking women. Why? Gender is the extent we go to in order to be loved. This is the argument that this paper is exploring. Gender is the extent we go to in order to be loved is also no doubt the most popular line from Robert Gluck's 1994 novel Marjorie Kemp. I have heard people say it in order to be loved. I have seen it posted on Goodreads, printed on a hoodie. I have said it. I have worn the hoodie. In a lecture in 2022, Kay Gabriel has tapped this sentence as a resource for transmaterialism. Not only does Gluck's phrase jolt any congealed notion of gender as merely natural or personal into a messy relationality, it also implies that we can't simply renounce or romanticize this love. In this sense, for Kay, the novel's use of the L word helps to situate gender as a symptom, which is to say, a highly idiosyncratic process of socialization mediating between social reproduction and desire. But just what kind of love extends gender in this novel? This paper will address two characteristics of love in Marjorie Kemp. Love as unrequited and as invasive, before it turns to the formal strategies of collaborative depersonalization that ultimately authorize a detachment in love. A new narrative novel from the 1990s constitutes an avoidant object choice for a paper that bombastically announces its transmaterialism, but this detachment, I argue, might prompt us to rethink something in the contemporary struggle for gender liberation. Gluck's novel juxtaposes two coextensive, yet incommensurable love stories. The medieval mystic Marjorie Kemp loves Jesus. The first-person narrator, Bob, loves Elle. While it appropriates interiors and interiorities from the 15th century, the Book of Marjorie Kemp, Gluck's text is disinterested in passing as a historical novel. Gluck reads Marjorie Kemp, he has explicitly said, as a phenomenon of the 20th century that has turned her manuscript into the first autobiography in the English language. In this vein, I read his read on Marjorie as a symptom of romantic popular culture during the short end of history. With the poet's suspicion of plot every two precious sentence, the novel constructs a camp fantasy of origin. It retrojects no less than the arrival of modern, and for the purposes of this paper, gendered inner life into the shift from mystic to romantic obsession. Inner life, Gluck writes, is a kind of greed, desire, a form of profit. Marjorie steps into modernity, so empty, she needs an autobiography. Notice how the sentence hides here, how gender leaps out in this riff on a sex change fable from Ambroise Paré's 1573 collection, a contemporary abstraction implanted into the body of a paragraph, otherwise in full Ren Fair cosplay. From agricultural but mostly reproductive activities, in this fantasy of history, gender drops inside out in the slipstream of a dissociative lexical break, formalizing its unevenness, or as Marianne Cetinich has put it, incoherent mapping onto value. Just as with so many transitions, however, there's no landing that follows this jump. If gender is the extent we go to in order to be loved, ironically, devastatingly in Marjorie Kemp, it is also the extent we go to in order to be not loved back. The unrequitedness of love in general, Gluck writes in an essay discussing the poetics of the novel, is conveyed through the specifics of a love story. I read this mission statement in a Berlantian key. The visceral abstractions of capital, threatening to brutally establish life in general, are both conveyed and scotomized in genres of romantic love. The fantasy forms, Berland writes, that structure popular love discourse constantly express the desire of a love to simplify living. For both Marjorie and Bob, gender drops inside out deep into their bodies, in, of all places, the purgatory of a life-changing situationship. He enlarges me by not returning my love, white deserts across which my being hurdles. At first glance, it would be easy to dismiss these contradictions with pseudo-Lacanian truisms about the structural impossibility of the sexual relation, etc., which seems especially relevant if your lover is God's son. However, as the novel maps life's unrequitedness onto sexual excitation, and there is so much fucking in this book, it touches on something irrejectable, invasive in the pursuit of love. If gender is the extent we go to in order to be loved, that sentence structure suggests love as a horizon of the social form of gender. Marjorie Kemp describes too the visceral inversion or introjection of this horizon into the self. Love is the exigency through which we find ourselves gendered, through which we find gender, a whole mode of reproduction really, in ourselves. In the novel, that is as uncanny as it is hot. As Bob leans into impersonating, which is to say depersonalizing Marjorie more explicitly, Towards the end of the novel, he discovers his own feminization as an after effect of his lover's intrusion of avoidance. What is this to say? I didn't know I had a cunt till he wriggled his fingers inside me. While Gluck, again, is explicit about life's unrequitedness, we have to spell out just how invasive this unrequitedness becomes. Even as the objects of desire always already recede, the obsession seems to infiltrate the need, or vice versa. Jesus, who first emerges for Marjorie from the throes of a postpartum depression, obliquely addresses her needs. He breastfeeds her like a mother, asks her to nurse him. In the wake of this excess of reproduction, even as Marjorie fails to commune with him or become a saint, she traverses her role as mercantile housewife. She pays her husband out of her marital duties, travels around to chase her own saintliness, to descend into downward mobility. The love that in Marjorie Kemp orients gender is invasive. Marjorie feels Jesus as a separate consciousness in her body and unrequited. She's always already abandoned. Not enough because it is too much. Laying my cards on the table here, gender is the extent we go to in order to find love from two theoretical angles. From a certain, we could call it materialist psychoanalytic perspective, love is another word for ambivalence. Gender is the extent we go to in order to live with and against this ambivalence. With Jean Laplanche, as he's put to work by Afki Sakapotoulou, Anne Pellegrini, and others struggling against both the discipline's reactionary transphobia and liberal flattening of gender-affirming treatment, we can describe the caregiving we depend on as compromised by its own incoherency, and in that sense, it is unrequited and invasive. The invasiveness of others' care, the sexual excess that both drives and destabilizes it, in short, their love, for Laplanche sets into motion the processes from which psychic reality itself emerges. Gender names, then, one specific social shape through which we metabolize that what remains intrusive and unrequited, asymmetrical in love. Laplanche and even some of the clinicians trying to radicalize his work describe this as fundamental anthropological situation. This is where we jump the irrigation ditch into Marxist feminism to say simply that this asymmetry of care can only be grasped through a mode of reproduction, ours. Famously, from this perspective, they say it is love, we say it is we say it is unwaged work. Gender is the extent we go to in order to do the exigency through which we find ourselves implicated in this work, in how it is not just work. Which is also kind of like a way of saying that gender, in the vein that Marina Wishmet, Zoe Sutherland, but also, for example, Emmy Diaz have tried to, I think, elaborate, is not entirely determined by or what we lose if we conceptualize gender through purely through labor. What we lose is antagonism. Where capital is both dependent on social reproduction but also destabilizes it, gender becomes a side of this, of labor's negativity. This negativity is marked not simply by the occlusion of women's reproductive labor from value, but the formal operation of value itself. Behind our backs, constituting gender in a, to quote Cynthia Rusa, totality of constraints that both grounds and exceeds capital's social in synthesis. I go to the lengths of these theoretical leaps, even though they don't really have a chance to land, in order to make a really relatively simple claim. If we turn to love as a good enough name for the theme of gender, it might become relatively intuitive why we can neither abolish nor valorize, neither in Orrin Goslim's terms, wildly affirm nor widely condemn this conflation of our needs and desires. Gender points to how we try to metabolize the contradiction of love under capital, while always wanting something entirely different than to just get by, more and less than to merely survive. And I thinking here too of something that Marina Wishmet has said in conversation with Danny in this zine or piece conversation that's called self-dissolution to the rest of us, to the right of us, self-dissolution to the left of us. And there she talks about how this mediation between self-abolition and self-affirmation unfolds as a painful contradiction. And I wonder if transmaterialism is one way to grasp kind of the pleasurableness of that pain. Gluck's Marjorie Kemp doesn't stop at invasive unrequitedness. It depersonalizes it. Many of the affects that gender the lovers in the novel are not, strictly speaking, their own. The body blows of love that rip through Bob and Marjorie take shape in the quasi-epistolary mode of a social context. At the very broken heart of this impurely modernist double autobiography, we find love's unrequitedness suspended or held in the social. Gluck describes it as a triptych. And in the center, my fear hollows out an empty space that I can't fill. That's how Ed describes his death. Ed's death, we learn from a recent Gluck memoir from AIDS. They are a village producing images, but more importantly, they are producing an imagelessness that is a mediation of social suffering. What the friends authorize as they authorize Bob's romantic suffering in this sense is not platonic redemption from infatuation in the safe hands of a community. Implicating themselves, they provide a social scale against which Marjorie's and Bob's obsessions can become both farcical and fun, depersonalized. Rather than world building, to steal a formulation from Danny's, they are wound building. There's more to say about this distinctly 1990s formal strategy, the politics of gender interminacy in the novel more broadly, and its devotion to metatextual end-of-history moods of fatalism. And most importantly, a couple of writers dipping their toes into co-authorship do not a popular front make. But they might give us a prompt to think about transmaterialism in terms of love. For what is the infrastructure of queer and trans lives, if not notes about bodies sent back and forth on a scale that is rapidly exploding itself and the very abstraction of the body? The scandal of trans popular culture is how it lets life's unrequitedness crystallize into a slightly different love story. In spite of all its sentimentalism, at its best, trans popular culture provides the grounds for new detachment styles, the terms of which are both shockingly concrete and totalizingly open-ended. Access to surgery is the extent we go to in order to be loved. Affordable housing is the extent we go to in order to be loved. Dropping an octave when screaming "Free Palestine" is the extent we go to in order to be loved. Wanting it all is the extent we go to in order to be loved. If heartbreakingly we know that a trans public is not at all the Islamo-Gushist popular front that fascists make it out to be, at its best, this is what it makes it an opening for struggle and critique, and specifically for embracing the conflictual mediation of them levels, modes, and front lines. Not primarily in order to achieve clarity, but implication. If once some other failed waves of sexual politics demanded free love, transmaterialism works through, to borrow Kerstin's formulation, implicated love. Implicated in our ambivalence, invasiveness, and unrequitedness, insisting that they can be lived differently. So we may be finally bad to one another, to quote from Rosie's book, outside this planetary death drive. Whereas many liberals still think that the trans and transsexual stands for loosely 68 ethics of transgression, for undoing or pushing boundaries, in the right hands and our hands, it will have to mean a love of mediation, of the boundary, of bearing life's unrequitedness with each other. To quote Nora Treat Baby, "You said, 'Welcome to love, my angels.' You said, 'Distance does not need to be a language of pain.' You said, 'Here, we are real.'" Thank you.